the next method we are going to talk about this week are HSTs.
HST stands for half square triangle.
And we're jumping around a little bit in the pattern to do the sew along style of learning how to quilt. I wanted to do the HSTs and stitch and flip all in one fell swoop, but where is my pages on that? This is page 15 where we're talking all about the HSTs. This is why you cut larger squares than your squares for your quilt blocks, like the 3.5-inch squares for your quilt block, or you're using a 4.5-inch square. So then you're cutting anywhere from a 4 to a 5.5-inch block. If you've never made an HST before, go with the larger size, which is 4.5-inch for a 3.5-inch block, or 5.5-inch for a 4.5-inch block, because that's going to give you some wiggle room when you go to trim them down to size. Once you get really good at HSTs, your lines are always perfectly straight, and you have a common distance of trimming all the time, then you can decrease the size of square that you're sewing to make 2 HSTs. Typically about a 1/2 inch bigger will still give you a little bit of trimming room than your finished size square. So for a 3.5-inch square that you need to cut to that size, you are probably going to want a 4-inch square, and that's going to give you enough room once you're comfortable with this. So I'm going to show you how to make 3.5-inch HSTs. They finish at 3 inches. That would be for the standard size quilt with the cover quilt. For the standard size block, using 3.5-inch squares. You will do the exact same thing if you are using the 4.5-inch square quilt. You'll just cut out the larger size. And it tells you in the cutting instructions, if you're doing the larger size quilt, what to sub in. But in the cutting instructions for the 3.5-inch cover quilt, you're going to do this as piece D is for your HSTs, and it tells you what size to make them and how many of each color to cut out to make this exact replica, or again, subbing in the colors for what you want. So I have the purple, and we can put it with a blue. So we're doing right sides together again. HST stands for half square triangle. So it's going to end up being a square that is half of a triangle, like this. So each set of 2 squares makes 2 HSTs. So it's going to make, if your fabric is non-directional like these two, it's going to make 2 HSTs that you can turn any direction. If your fabric is directional, you're going to have certain directions happen from depending on which way you put the fabric. But because we're putting HSTs on all 4 sides, and on all 4 sides we have HSTs going 2 different directions, probably you're going to be fine if you're directional and you just do an equal amount, so to speak, in each direction. You can kind of play around with it. If you want your HSTs to be this direction, see how then both of my prints are going vertical? So then you know, once you let this fold over, that you need to put the top one going in a horizontal. But and then your second HST will be this way. So it's just the reverse of the first HST. Now if we did the fabric opposite and we did that same direction, one of the prints would be upside down. Not a big deal because one of our prints is not fully directional, it's just vertically directional, so we could flip it. But if both were vertically directional, this would be an upside down and it wouldn't be able to be flipped. And then the opposite one that is made would be the opposite. So when you're switching the direction of your front fabric, you want to switch the direction of the angle. And then if our angle goes this way, we would have it be right side up that way and right side up this way. So it's something you need to play around with directional fabric, unless you don't care, which is totally fine too. These two, again, are pretty non-directional, so it's just kind of more the direction you want your fabrics to be. You want to note on the pattern that all of our outside fabric is purple and all of our, or pink, I'm sorry, all of our outside fabric is pink, and then the blue and the purple alternate on the inside. So you kind of have to make a decision. If this was a blue and purple fabric, let's say it was actually pink and purple fabric, let's go pink and blue fabric. Then we would have blue here, pink there, so pink and blue. So we know that this would go there, 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 there. And then you could also sub it in over here on this side for the blues. The opposite one that we're going to cut when we make them and cut apart is going to be like this. So it's actually going to go in this section or in this section. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're making them. If your fabric, you want half and half, so to speak. It can be a little mind numbing, but for the most part, you can just flip them and they'll be fine, or just don't worry about kind of the direction of those HSTs. Let's start with this one here. We want to mark a diagonal line just like we did on the back of our piece B for the stitch and flip. We only need to do it on the back of one of these. There's two options you can do. You can mark one diagonal line like I did and then sew 1/4 of an inch to the outside this way and 1/4 of an inch to the outside this way. We're going to sew 2 lines on an HST. Or if you have a handy dandy ruler like this, you could align the middle line on the points and you could actually do 2 lines that you could sew directly on top of. Now, these are lines you can sew directly on top of because once we sew it and we open it up, we have to trim it down to size. We're trimming these down to 3.5. We have plenty of usable space around there, so it does not, we're not worried about sewing slightly to the side of the line to take up that extra space to give us the extra fabric. We can sew directly on top of these marked lines. Even if you are working for a 3.5 inch HST and you cut these at 4 inches instead of 4.5, you're probably going to still trim off anywhere from a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch. So sewing directly on top of those lines will be fine. I'm going to hold this up a little bit more. Those lines might be hard to see. You can see them in the pattern, how we have the directional line, and then you're going to sew 1/4 inch to the side of that center line, unless you end up drawing 2 lines 1/4 inch away from the center. So we're going to go sew those 2 marked lines, and then we're going to come back here and finish up our HSTs. Okay, we have our first set of squares. I'm going to do 2 sets up here, and they are aligned along all the edges. I have my diagonal line marked. I just did a single diagonal line, and I am going to sew 1/4 of an inch to each side of it. Now you can choose which way you want to do it. If you want to sew 1/4 of an inch to this line side to start, or if you want to flip it and sew 1/4 of an inch to that side of the line. Either doesn't really matter. The trick is just to make sure that you know where 1/4 of an inch is. I know based on my tape, so running that line along the tape is good, and I know kind of based on how far away that line should be from the edge of my foot. And again, because this is on the point, if you stretch the fabric, it stretches it on the bias, it's called, and that's not good. You want to just guide it through. Usually one hand on one side is ideal. We do not want to stretch that fabric at all. So there I have a seam sewn to 1/4 of an inch to that side of my line. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And if you are used to it, you can do what I'm doing. Just move your fabric and your line will be on different sides of your foot. Or you can turn your fabric and keep your line on the same side as your foot. Either way is fine. Just do what is comfortable with you. Again, the main thing with this, because we have plenty of wiggle room for trimming, is that you keep that line straight. If it happens to be a little bit wider than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, totally fine. When you get into smaller squares, you might need to pay more attention to that seam allowance, but we have enough wiggle room. Just keeping that seam as straight as possible and equally parallel to the middle line is our goal here. So you can see the marked line, you can see the 2 seamed lines. On this one, it's harder to see because it's darker fabric. I should have thought about that. I don't know if you can see down here by my thumb. I have a center marked line and then the 2 outside lines. I didn't necessarily need to mark the center, but I already had it on there when I was demonstrating marking the 2 side lines. But I can sew directly on top of those side lines. Again, right sides together. This one is non-directional, so it doesn't really matter which orientation it goes. And making sure all my points and corners are aligned. And I am sewing with my needle directly on top of one of those lines. So there we have our first seam. Then you can see the middle line, and I'm going to sew over here on the second line for our second seam. Okay, so we have our 2 seams, and we are going to go cut these HSTs apart and see what the magic of making an HST is all about. Okay, I ended up sewing 2 sets of HSTs. So this is 4 squares. This is going to make 4 HSTs. Basically, however many squares you put in, you're going to get that same amount of HSTs out. You do have to have an even number of squares though. This is a great job for your 6x12 ruler. You're going to align it point to point or right along that marked line, and you're going to cut right down that line. Make sure your blade is sharp. I realized I did not have any rotary blades. I had to order some. So, second one, right point to point, right on the marked line. This is where the magic happens. We're going to kind of turn these because this is how an HST is. When you open it up, you have 2 HSTs, and you can see they're opposites. I can turn this one around to be at 2 identical because it's non-directional fabric. Let me go iron these real quick, and I'm just going to press them so they're open and the seam is as flat as possible, and then I'll be back and we will trim them down. Okay, in this quilt, it doesn't really matter which way you iron the seams. Sometimes if you're having 4 HSTs come together in the middle, you are going to want those seams to be ironed in opposite directions so that they all nest nicely. But we don't really have that problem here. So what we have are our 2 sets of HSTs. Now you can see with this one, because it's directional, you don't really want to turn it that way because they're going sideways, and you don't want to turn it that way because then your cans are upside down. And in this one, even though the strawberries go both directions, most of them go in the opposite direction of what it is right now. So that's just something to keep in mind when your fabric is directional. But again, on our cover quilt, we have multiple sides and orientations. So say this is the piece I need to be facing the quilt. It could go here as well as over here. And this one could go here as well as over here. So there's really plenty of spaces as long as you have an even amount of the orientation that needs to happen. This one, like I said before, if your fabric is non-directional, you can turn these every which way and it does not matter at all. So we're going to trim these down. So there's 2 ways to trim these down, and I don't expect you to have a fancy ruler like this. This is called a block lock, and these are really great if you make a ton of HSTs in the same size because they're a little bit more expensive, but they have this groove right along the middle that helps butt up right next to the seam, like that seam catches the groove, And you can move it this way or this way, but it's not going to easily move past that groove. And then you can trim around it. I love a good black lock ruler. I use a lot of 3.5 and a lot of 6.5 HSTs. So those are the two sizes I've invested in. Otherwise, you're going to use your same ruler that you used for trimming your star points down of your stitch and flip points. And ideally, you would have marked it out so that this 45-degree angle line is going point to point on your ruler. And then you're going to use that 45-degree angle line and your tape to trim. And this is a great use of the rotating cutting mat, but I'm going to show you how to do it without that, since that's not a common thing for beginner quilters to have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this 45-degree angle right along my seam, just right where the two fabrics meet. And I'm going to make sure my first two corners that I'm going to trim down, that I have fabric to trim down. Alternately, I'm going to make sure that my 3.5-inch mark over here that I'm not trimming yet, that I have fabric that reaches below that, because I don't want to trim off a bunch of fabric over here only to go over on this side and realize, oh, I was too far over and this is going to be too small now. So I tend to trim a little off at first, and then I trim the bigger amount off the second time. So once I get that 45-degree line perfectly aligned over my seam, and make sure that I just have a little sliver to cut off on both sides, I hold it in position and I cut those two sides. And then you can let it go and pull away those two little pieces. Now you have a perfect corner. It should come perfectly at 90-degree angles to where that seam point is. I'm going to rotate this just around so that I can again line up my 45-degree line. But this time I'm going to line up my 3.5-inch mark, or if you're doing 4.5 inches, your 4.5-inch mark. I'm going to line up these tape lines, or just the mark on my ruler if you're not doing the tape. And then I'm going to cut off this excess up here, making sure that as best I can, that 45-degree angle line in the middle, corner to corner, is on top of the seam. Sometimes it might not be perfect if your seam isn't perfect, and that's fine. There is my square. That is the exact size I need at 3.5 inches to go with my block. Remember, these are 3.5-inch blocks. I am going to set that aside. That's fully ready to make into my border. You're going to continue doing this. It's a little bit of a lot to trim down all your HSTs, but let me tell you, when I first started quilting, I had no idea you are supposed to trim your HSTs. So I made HSTs like this, and I would cut off these little dog ears. And then in theory, if you cut all the squares at the same size and you sew 1/4 inch away, you're going to have all these HSTs after they're sewn that are the same size. But because of the angle and the pull of fabric, you can even see here, they're close, but they're not quite perfect. So sewing them all together can be a big, big pain. And I made lots of quilts like that. And I went years without knowing until somebody told me. And then I started trimming my HSTs. And while it is tedious, it takes time, it makes such a difference when you're sewing all of these pieces together after they're trimmed. They're all the exact same size. They sew up so nice. So what I would recommend is do this while you're watching a TV show, listening to an audiobook, hanging out with your kids and they're like coloring or occupied but don't need like hands-on attention. This is a great little chore, I guess, to save for those sort of times. I love to listen to a good audiobook or watch a show. Typically not watch, but I love to listen to a show that I've already seen while I'm doing this, and it's kind of like a relaxing time for me. If you can master the art of doing this while you're sitting, it's even more awesome, because I don't have as good of leverage as I'm sitting to trim down like this, but I know a lot of people do. If you're standing while you're trimming these, maybe get one of those fancy cushy mats for your feet because you will get tired even just standing. I think the most I've ever like trimmed down in one day was like over 500. I trimmed down 500 plus HSTs at a retreat just sitting on the floor one time. So that's how you make an HST. You can kind of see that there is a little bit of paying attention that needs to happen if you have directional fabric. For the cover quilt, every HST has a pink square or whatever color you've subbed in for your pink square. Every HST in the cover quilt has a pink background square. So every HST you make is going to get a pink square, and then you're going to have half with purple and half with blue. And what I would recommend is if you do, if you take your purple and your purple's on the top and your pink is on the bottom, right sides together, do your diagonal lines that you mark, half of them going this way and half going that way. And that should give you a good balance. And do the same with your blue. Put the pink on the bottom, the blues face down on the top, and mark half your lines going this way and half your lines going that way. And that will give you an equal amount of the different directions of your HSTs so you can make the whole border without worrying about direction too much. And then just pay attention when you're putting your pink on the back, have the pattern be going vertical. And then when you have your purple or blue on the front, have the pattern be going horizontal in one direction. And that'll help you get those to line up like this so that they're both in the directional way. Or don't worry about it and just go through and make your HSTs however and be happy with having a beautiful finished quilt. So that's how you make HSTs. And that for the quilt is at the end of the pattern. Once you make all the HSTs, you are then going to be sewing the HST borders. These are the borders, which we will talk about when we talk about assembling the quilt. We will talk about assembling the borders as well. So if you want to, you could definitely go do all your HSTs now and line them up into borders following the instructions. But we will talk about that when we're assembling the quilt in a couple weeks. Please feel free to ask any questions. Email me, ask questions on the blog, ask questions on Instagram. Email and Instagram are going to get you the quickest answers. So just keep that in mind. I do check YouTube and blog comments, but I don't check those daily, so it takes me a little bit longer to get back to you.